So now let's talk about picking a printer to work with. And I just want to give you some ideas. So if you ever want to do this process, if you ever want to print a graphic novel, or you know somebody who does, just some ideas to put in your head about how this works, what the costs are, and how to make sure that you're going to get like an actual high quality job. Now, the first part of getting a high quality job from a printer and doing it right, you now already know, because everything we just talked about, you're like so far ahead of somebody who doesn't know all that stuff, because now you know all about the inking process, you know all about the prepress, you know all that stuff. And so you're already in a position to talk to your printer and ask them questions, prepare them good quality input files, and you'll be saying things that if they don't know what they're doing, it'll be kind of apparent to you probably pretty soon, right? So you're already got a little bit of a leg up, because if you know all this stuff and how like I see color profiles work and how the printing press process goes and flat blacks and rich blacks and spot gloss and all this stuff, if you know those things, you know, you can at least have a little bit better time of like detecting if there's something off, right? Because you know what's going on. You're not just taking what they say and assuming it's true. You've got some context to understand the process, and when they say something, if it doesn't seem to slot into the understanding, you can be like, wait, what? And you know, get a little bit more clarification and more information for them from them on that. So let's talk about other things you can do to help pick a good printer. And I'm going to talk about it in two phases. One is looking for artifacts, and the other is pricing. So I'm going to take it as a given that after everything that I just said in all of the previous stuff about prepress, that you now know what you're looking for in terms of when you go to look for a printer, you know what you need. You need a high volume, high volume is probably a low term. You know how many you need to print, 500, 1,000, 2,000 copies. So you know your volume. You know what you're printing. Like I said, you want like roughly, maybe you're looking for some sort of 80-pound matte paper interior, and maybe you want, 12-point cover with spot UV or, and the foils, right? So you'll at least know when you go to the printer's webpage, or you call them on the phone or email them, you can ask if they have what you need. So you're going to know, do they even have the capability to do what you need? So assuming you've found someone who has the capability of what you need, you can tell them about your job. In our case, we have a 192-page graphic novel. We want printed 80-pound matte paper on the interior. We want a spot UV matte cover with spot gloss, 12-point. 12-point is like heavier than after a certain number of pounds, they go up to points. Paper weights are bizarre. We'll have to look that one up later too, why they do that. This is a job. Is that something you guys can handle, right? And so you're going to know whether they're in the running at all if you contact some printers, because it's whether they can even do this thing at all. But then after they say they can or can't do it, you want to impress upon them, we're looking for really high quality work, and we want to see samples of something close to what we're asking for. So can you send us something, right? And what you want to do is you want to take that something that they send you, and you want to really scrutinize it for issues. So I'm going to now show you what it will look like when you don't really see much in the way of issues. So here, for example, is a graphic novel, right? And if we zoom in on this, as I'm looking through here, what do I see? Well, it's true that maybe there's a little bit of chromatic aberration along those edges. I don't see very much that isn't probably mostly due to my camera, if we're honest about it, right? And if you look at the millimeter ruler here, I mean, looking at areas where different colors touch each other, and just looking at places where you might have blacks that roll off into other colors, you can start to just like scrutinize this. Do you see any egregious errors, right? And you don't, right? And if you look at some professional ones that you have on your shelf, you're not going to see anything weird when you start looking at these, right? You're going to see pretty clean. You know what I'm saying? It's going to be pretty clean. And so you can look in there, you can see like, you shouldn't see too much blur on those lines. And again, like I said, I don't know how much, I don't have a macro lens, so I can't really zoom in here and tell too much on those. Like, I don't think that's an RB blur, so that's probably not them. That's probably my camera. But if you happen to have a macro lens, or you could slap them on a scanner if you have a good flatbed scanner. But the point is, you shouldn't see anything on the millimeter scale, right? What does it look like when you do? Well, here's an example of a sample we got from someone who we did not go with for very obvious reasons. Look at how much chromatic aberration you can see in this. It's like at least a third of a millimeter, if not a half millimeter on the millimeter ruler, right? And you can see like this is nowhere near the camera resolution. I can zoom out pretty far and it is obvious, right? And this is exactly the thing I was talking about. If they don't have a good registration process when they print something, you can see immediately these really bad sort of fringe artifacts there. Now, never mind the fact that nobody should have probably been printing a 21 with rich black in the first place, so the prepress sucked on this as well. But, even if it hadn't, you would have seen a lot of this chromatic aberration just in the quality of the print job is just not going to be very good, right? Because you got these really big errors everywhere. And yeah, when you look at the the thing, if you're just looking at it from here, maybe it doesn't look that bad, but it definitely looks worse than a high quality print job, right? So you really want to look at those registration errors, see how the inks look. Do the inks look nice and vibrant? Does the paper look good? Is the registration on target? You shouldn't see any real errors, especially not with the naked eye, which you can here. But even when you zoom in, that should be pretty close. You shouldn't be seeing like millimeter error, like a third of a millimeter or quarter of a millimeter errors are not a common tolerance. Like modern registration is pretty darn good. There is a bit of wobble there, but it's not like that, right? Okay. So, and just to show, like, this is the same book, right? You can see, here's another example. So this time it was the cyan plate that was deregistered, right? And the magenta and the yellow plates were, like, aligned. So I already told you all this, right? You should know, just by looking at that, you can see what happened, right? You had a CMY pass on top of your black pass. So this was a rich black, and the cyan plate was shifted up, right? I mean, that's what that is. So that's what you don't want to see, and that's how you know you've got a quality registration process and a quality inking process if you're not seeing those errors. There's other errors you could see. You don't want to see like a flimsy binding, right? You don't want to see this kind of thing happening, right, where it's pulling apart. You don't want to see glue errors, and you can kind of see in here, right, and so on. So you just want to scrutinize the book. Take a good look at a high-quality graphic novel printed recently. You know what it looks like. Look it through. It looks good. There aren't these obvious errors. Take a look at the samples. It should look that good. That's what you're looking for, right? Now, we didn't talk much about binding, and we can mention binding a little bit. There's really not much for you to pick other than what type of binding you actually want. Most graphic novels are what are called perfect bound. And what that is when you actually take all the sheets of paper. So let me do an aside on binding, just so you kind of have a little bit of the process. So when all these sheets come out and they get cut, you then have all of the sheets getting assembled into what constitutes the actual interior of the book without the cover. That's called a book block, I believe, in printer parlance. So like one physical unit of the interior pages of one whole book is called a book block. And the book block essentially gets into usually a machine. You can do this by hand. There are people who do perfect bindings by hand, like artisan binderies and stuff like this. You can do it by hand too. But I believe they're almost always done by machine at any high volume place because, oh my God, it would be really hard to do by hand. So it's going to go into a machine that's effectively going to grind away and create pitting in the binding side of all of those pages of the book block. So all the books are stacked up, and the binding side, it's going to like grind and make pitting in there. And then it's going to suffuse that with glue. And so that the book is now like physically like adhered together in like just that one region. And you can see, I don't know if the webcam is good enough to show you this, but if you've got one at home, you could pick it up. Let me go ahead and just try adding like a whole one here. I don't know if I can make this webcam bigger here. But oh, you know what? I don't even have to do that. Let me just use that Kickstarter video again, because that one was, I believe, showed the binding very clearly in one of the shots there as it was coming up. Okay, so if we go to if we go to mollyrocket.com/projects, that should take us straight there right now, since that's our going project. So if we go back to that binding video, which is right here, you can see without the low resolution webcam, you can actually see as this gets tilted. Do you see that crease? Do you see it running right down there? So right? And when you turn the pages, you'll see that there's like a little bit that doesn't really turn to a certain extent, right?
And you can see that the reflection
and
is very
that
sort of
itself
dulled, and
is the perfect binding process at work. Glue was injected in at just that one end and created like a solid block all the way along that strip. So now the book has been like fused together with glue, basically, so that it won't like come apart anymore at that end. So that is what they do to the book block. And once that's been glued together, they wrap the cover around it, basically, and glue that on against the end of the book block. And that's how you get a perfect binding. And that's what almost all graphic novels that I see use. But you can do whatever you want. There's all kinds of other binding styles. There's saddle stitch, where they actually like put like thread through it. There's spiral bound, where there's like, actual physical rings going through it. Do whatever you want. But I believe graphic novels nowadays, at least anyone that I've ever seen, and really, I mean, if it's not a hardcover book, if it's a soft cover, or trade paperback or any of that stuff, it's perfect binding seems like what I've seen for graphic novels pretty much always these days. I don't know. That could be wrong. I'm not a graphic novel expert by any stretch of the imagination. Like, we went through this process to make one, so I learned all the technical details, but I'm far from authoritative on like what the latest issue of like Spider-Man is or something, right? So anyway, that's just an aside on the binding process. And again, really all you're looking for there is, does it look like a competent job? It should not come apart at all. If you want to actually rip the binding, you should have to apply a lot of force to rip that binding. So push in there a little bit, make sure there's not a lot of give, make sure there's not glue coming apart there or paint peeling. I mean, it's not paint, it's ink, but like ink transferring to the wrong side because like the glue went in, or, make sure there's none of that. And assuming that you've satisfied yourself that the samples from the printer are good enough quality, then you're usually pretty good to go. And the only things you have to start worrying about then is the price of the print job. I think I've covered just about everything else you might want to know. So before I go into pricing and how that works, let me just take one more break for questions if anyone has them. Looks like no questions, so I think we can just roll into the last section, and then we're good. And then you know everything I know about printing. Okay. So, as you've heard me say over and over again throughout the entire part where I was talking about prepress, and then how the printing press actually operates and all that stuff, what you need to understand now is that everything I said there implies that there is not a flat cost to producing an individual book, right? Because think about all the stuff I said. You got to buy inks in bulk. You got to buy paper in bulk. You got to set up like these coding processes. You have to make individual plates. Like we were estimating 12 of them for Meow the Infinite that are actual physical etchings for laying down ink through a process. You've got to mount all that stuff on your press and start running it, right? So it's not the kind of thing where the cost to print a book is X dollars. That's not how it works. There is like a massive amount of like investment into printing just one book. But once you've done all of that investment in creating all the stuff and setting up the press, the actual cost to print any individual book is considerably less, right? So you have to approach the printing process thinking about it much more like an industrial fabrication process, because that's basically what it is. It's a lot like making the casings for an iPhone. You have to make a whole tooling with like a mold that's going to get stuff poured into it and all that stuff. And once you actually have the machine and some people sitting there to like operate it to produce these iPhone cases, well, each individual iPhone case isn't very expensive, now is it? But all of that work, making the molds, designing like the, machinery to do it properly, all that stuff, that was the work. Now, it's not high tech because it's printing. We understand it now. It's fairly well streamlined. So it's not like they have to engineer anything, but much like just making the molds for something, it still has to happen. So there's a physical process with some manual labor. It involves computers now too. So there's like a computer operator who's going to, have it start doing some kind of like lithography to print the plate or something like this, right? That whole process costs time, materials, and you're going to pay for it whether you print a single book or 10,000 books. So the actual anatomy of a print process looks very different depending on what number of books you're actually trying to make. And this is why you will see stuff like print on demand, for example, or printing 50 books. They won't even use a offset printing process like the multiple passes of ink onto giant sheets. They won't even do that. They'll use like an inkjet printer basically to print small volumes of things. Why? Because if you're only printing one book that needs to get shipped to one person right now, you don't get any savings from doing any of the stuff we were just talking about, because you'd waste all of your money producing these things and then you'd roll one book out of there and then you got to take them off, right? It just doesn't make sense. So fundamentally speaking, the primary thing you have to be aware of is it's definitely, if you're talking about starting to print 500, 1,000, 2,000 books, which is generally what you're going to be looking at in this case, you don't want to be thinking of it as a per book cost model, because that's just fundamentally not what it looks like, right? It looks like a breakdown. So let's take a look at an example. So this, if it could load up, there we go. So this is an actual set of estimates. So these aren't fictitious. I didn't make them up. These are an actual set of estimates from an actual printer's online estimation tool. So when you go for an automated quote, these are actually what you would get back for printing Meow the Infinite with them. And what you can see here is the curve is not even close to a line, right? At 1,000 books, it costs almost $8 to print a book. Now, $8. And considering the fact that, like, once you actually talk about, because, like, if you talk about our Kickstarter, the cheapest tier that includes a printed copy is $25. Where does that price come from? Well, if you start thinking about the actual pricing model, it costs us $8 roughly for the most expensive shipping we might do in the continental or actually extended United States. Because shipping is actually, this is one of the weirdest things about printing books now. Shipping is actually more expensive often than the book, right? So you have somewhere between a $5 and $8 shipping charge, and then you're going to have like an $8 to print out the book charge, right? So you're talking about something like $16 of fixed cost that you have to pay before you've done any accounting for all the work. Like before you even count trying to pay Anna for the time it took her to draw the book, right? So you can see that that's a big deal actually, because as that number gets pretty high, you're starting to not make anything on this book, and you're more or less made it for free. Like all of your labor and all of the work you did, you just paid for it yourself, right? So you really don't want to be at the 1,000 line. You probably want to be more like at the 2,000 line. As this gets down, as you can print more of these out, you start to get to a knee of the curve where you're almost getting like, you're down to like only about $5 per book. And that means you're actually have a lot more headroom there, right? If you're selling a book for $20 or $25, you can actually recoup some reasonable amount of money if you're able to sell 500 or 1,000 of these things, right? Now, it's not programmer money, right? Like, it's not going to compete with tech, right? But nobody makes a comic because they're trying to compete with tech, right? I mean, those are ridiculous salaries, right? You're just trying to make something. You're trying to be self-sustaining, whatever, right? You're trying to make something out of it. And you can see you really don't want to be up here, especially not if you ever want to have a sale on these things. Like, if you ever want to sell, heaven forfend, you try to sell a book for $15 at that point. You make nothing. You're losing money on everyone at that point between the shipping and the book. So you can see that this curve is very, very curve. It is not a line, right? And so you can see as you increase the number of copies, you come down to an asymptotic per book rate. And that's specifically because, like I said, there's a big fixed upfront cost. And then every book you print, those books cost very little. So the actual amount that you're maybe paying per book might be only like $3 per book. But there was a huge $5,000, $6,000 upfront cost or something like that you had to pay if you only even printed one. So at some level, you have to look at this in volume. You simply won't ever be able to be self-sustaining or even pay yourself a modicum of money for your time making a comic if you don't take into account the fact that the volume curve is really not in your favor if you're anywhere under 2,000. And what you can see here when you look at this curve, right, is that 2,000 really is one of the points of diminishing returns. It's sort of an inflection point in this curve, somewhere around 2,500 for this particular printer. You can see that you start to like level out. So as you increase 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, you're not saving that much money per book as you're getting up to these really high rates. So it really behooves you to figure out, can you find a way to sell 2,000 of these books over time? If you can, that will make it a lot more likely that you can really pay yourself something for having done all the work. Whereas if you're printing 500, heaven forfend, or even 1,000, it's really hard to pay yourself anything for the time that you put into this. And it's really actually pretty sad, in my opinion, because drawing comic is a fantastic amount of work for an artist. I mean, they make next to nothing on it, and it is so much work. I mean, every page is 8 or 9 drawings in full color that they have to make, and they're making 300 pages of these over the course of 2 books or something like that, right? I mean, it's amazing what comic artists do and how diligent they are to ever get a comic done. If an artist ever gets a comic done, I think they deserve a tremendous amount of credit because it is like an incredibly, incredibly labor-intensive process. And especially if that comic actually looks good, I mean, wow. So again, it's not in your favor. Physical goods never are. Nobody wants to pay $50 for a graphic novel unless you are the world's most lauded comic artist or something. So you're just really trying to figure out, can you maybe make it to like the 2,000 range and hope over a couple years to sell those books, and maybe you store them in your garage it really does help because then you're at least making something on every copy instead of really not making something. This is also where conventions help because a convention doesn't have the shipping overhead. So yeah, you got to pay $100, $200 for the table, but if it's a local convention, well, $200 divided by 8, right? That's only 20, 25 books you have to sell at that convention before you're clearing what your shipping costs would have been, and now you're never paying that shipping cost. So again, convention is really unfortunate that they're all going to be canceled because that's another way you can either A, reduce the price of your books. Instead of charging 25, maybe you can charge 15 or 20, which helps people be able to buy it. You know, someone's more likely to buy something if it's less expensive potentially, right? Or it just helps you recoup some money, you know, so that you can pay yourself something. So, but unfortunately, they're gone. Hopefully, maybe someday they'll come back. That's why they're very helpful for comic artists. That shipping goes away. So in addition to having the audience there, you're not paying these really big shipping charges because that's a huge cost on top of things. And so either you pass it on to the customer and you're charging $25 a book, or you just make nothing. And it's a little bit of an issue. So again, pricing curve, it's a bit rough. You want to be higher volume, but you only really have to make it to 2,000 and then you're pretty good shape. There's diminishing returns in terms of per book costs for going out that far. Now, one of the things I want to point out is I sort of said, oh, look, this is sort of like a fixed upfront cost plus a per book cost. Well, you know, a lot of us are programmers here. I'm certainly a programmer, so I thought you might want to see. Here's what happens if you just try to guess what's your printer's fixed cost and what's their per book cost. Again, this isn't the printer we went with. That's why I used it, because I didn't want to show their estimates and because, you know, that may be confidential to them and I don't want to put them on the spot. So I picked someone else who we did not use. And here's me making a curve that is just $5,500 of fixed cost to make the setup and $2.40 per book. And I mean, it's not the exact estimate, but it's real close, right? So again, that simplification of just thinking there's some upfront costs, probably $5,000, $6,000, and that includes the profit that the printer is making. So it's not the upfront cost to them, but it's the upfront cost in terms of they need to make some money too, right? That is plus some per book cost, which is probably around $2.40 for our particular configuration. It will go up or down depending on how fancy the cover is, depending on how heavy the paper is or how expensive the paper is, all those sorts of things. You can usually, by looking at a few estimates, you can usually just figure out what that is. It's such an obvious curve. It's not exactly how they're doing their estimates, as you can see, but it's pretty close, right? Okay. So that's how print pricing works. And generally speaking, in my experience, I haven't found that there's that much variation. If you ask for specific things and you make them give you a quote, it turns out that it's oftentimes very close. The difference between printers for professional quality graphic novel printing that I have seen is actually pretty consistent. And what this means, at least to me, is unless you really have some... one reason could be you live somewhere where you're very far from any center of industry where there might be a reasonably good press. But for us, a lot of people will use Print Ninja or something where it's they send the stuff off to China, it gets printed there, it gets loaded onto container ships and comes back here and then gets to you. Those places have literally 11 or 12 week turnaround times. It's 3 months between when you submit your final proofs and when you actually get the printed stuff back. And when you actually add in how much shipping charge, the estimate plus the shipping, and this included basically transport in this estimate. I was actually including that in here. Even though there are price breaks from the fact that printing in China is cheaper than printing here, it would appear, once you add in the actual shipping, it's basically the same. Their again, I don't want to give out people's estimates that they gave us, but we can get the same cost roughly, let's just say, of printing done locally as doing that whole ridiculous round trip process. The benefit, you can literally go down there if you need to. Again, coronavirus maybe makes that not as likely. But the other thing, the turnaround time is like a few weeks. So because we didn't go with a crazy overseas, go there, go put it on container ship, ship it back here, go through custom, right? Because we don't do that process, we're probably going to be able to deliver our graphic novels to our Kickstarter backers like in a fraction of the time it would have taken for people who just like go online and they see that a lot of people use this overseas stuff, so they do, right? So the one takeaway that I would say here from pricing, because obviously, you know, with everything I've told you, you now could go ask a printer for an estimate and you'd probably understand what you got back. But the one thing that I really want to press on is like local printers don't suck. Like there are good ones, and at least in our area, it appears that there are very good ones, and they are price competitive, especially if you actually take into account how much extra you're going to have to pay to do all of the shipping to get the books from overseas to here. And if you actually then bother to go put a premium on the fact that the turnaround time is very high, then it actually becomes much worse to print them overseas. Because now not only are you paying roughly the same price, but you also have this huge delay in your process, right? So I think local printing should maybe happen more. And I would highly recommend finding out what presses are available in your area and checking them out first before you decide on an overseas printing option, because there are a lot of benefits to it that are actually practical benefits to you. Get estimates from everybody. Get estimates from Print Ninja. Get estimates from anybody you can find, because you want to know what's available and you want to know what's out there. But don't pass up your local presses.